Have you ever started something with complete and genuine enthusiasm? A diet, a new business, a creative project, a fitness routine, a course you paid for and never finished. And somewhere in the middle, before it had time to work, before you had time to find out what was really possible, you stopped. Not because something catastrophic happened, not because you were told to stop, not because the path disappeared, but because something inside you just quietly gave out. And you probably told yourself a story. You told yourself it was not working, or that it was not the right time, or that you were too busy, too tired, not ready enough, not good enough, not quite there yet. But deep down, some part of you knew that was not the whole truth. Today I want to talk about the psychology of people who give up too soon. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This is not a video about laziness. This is not a lecture about discipline or willpower or motivation. Because everything I have studied and observed shows me that what most people call giving up has almost nothing to do with any of those things. It goes much deeper than that, it always does. Let us begin here. Your brain is not wired to help you succeed. I know that sounds dramatic, but stay with me for a moment because this is important. Your brain is wired to keep you safe, and those two things are not the same. In fact, they are often in direct conflict with each other. Safety, neurologically, means familiarity. It means predictability. It means the absence of threat. And the moment you start something new, whether it is a business, a relationship, a creative pursuit, a new habit, your brain registers the uncertainty involved as a potential threat. Because uncertainty, even positive uncertainty, activates the same threat detection systems in your brain as actual danger. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for processing threat, does not distinguish between, I might fail at this venture, and there is something dangerous in the room. Both activate the same alarm, both trigger the same biological response. And what does your brain want to do when it detects a threat? It wants to retreat. It wants to return to what is known and familiar. It wants to stop whatever is creating the uncertainty and go back to the comfort of the predictable. So when you feel that urge to quit, that sudden drop in motivation, that quiet voice that says this is not working, or maybe this just is not for me, or I will come back to this later, that is not a rational assessment of the situation. That is your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is protect you from perceived danger. The problem is that most people mistake a biological survival response for a personal truth. They hear that voice, they feel that pull towards stopping, and they interpret it as evidence that quitting is the right decision, when in reality it is often evidence that the process is working exactly as it should. But I want to go beyond the neuroscience. Because there is something even more specific operating beneath the surface. Something that turns a biological instinct into a repeating life pattern. In psychology, there is a concept called self-handicapping. It was first described by researchers Stephen Berglas and Edward Jones in 1978. Self-handicapping is the unconscious strategy of creating conditions for failure in advance, so that when failure comes, you have a ready explanation that protects your sense of self. Think about that carefully. Giving up early is one of the most common and most invisible forms of self-handicapping there is. Because if you quit before you have truly committed, before you have given something everything you had, you can always preserve a very important story. The story that says, I did not really fail, I just did not give it enough time, I could have done it, I chose not to. That interpretation feels infinitely safer than the alternative. The alternative being, you tried your absolute hardest, you gave it everything you had, and it still did not work. Because if that happens, the question that follows is terrifying. If I gave everything and it still was not enough, what does that say about me? It is that question, that specific fear, that drives more premature giving up than any lack of discipline or motivation ever could. And here is something that society gets completely wrong about this. We label people who give up as quitters, as weak, as undisciplined. We frame it as a character flaw, as something to be ashamed of. But that framing is not just wrong, it is harmful. Because when you tell someone who is already operating from a deep fear of failure that they are simply not disciplined enough, you confirm exactly the belief that is causing the problem. You do not solve it. Now let us go further back. Because this pattern almost never originates in adulthood. It almost always traces back to something that was formed much earlier, in experiences so small and ordinary that most people never think to connect them to their adult behavior. Think about a child who tried something new. Who raised their hand in class, not certain of the answer but willing to participate. Who showed a parent something they created, a drawing, a story, something they were proud of. who attempted something in front of other people and waited to see how it would be received, and imagined that what came back was not cruelty, not deliberate harm, just the quiet, everyday disappointment of an effort that was met with indifference, or mild criticism, or distraction, or comparison to someone who did it better. What does that child learn? They learn that visible effort is risky, that committing fully opens you up to fully visible failure, that it is safer to hold something back, to not try with everything you have, because then at least the failure is not total. At least there is a protected version of you, the one who could have succeeded if only you had really tried. That logic, built through repeated small experiences in childhood, operates quietly in the adult brain for decades. It becomes a rule, a strategy, a way of moving through the world that feels like personality when it is actually protection. The person who gives up on the gym after 4 days was not lazy. They were following a script written years ago that says full commitment equals full exposure to failure. The person who abandons the business after the first obstacle was not unmotivated. They were doing exactly what their brain learned to do long ago. This is closely connected to what psychologist Martin Seligman called learned helplessness, one of the most significant discoveries in behavioral psychology. In his original research in the 1960s, Seligman found that when living beings are repeatedly exposed to situations where their efforts do not change outcomes, they eventually stop trying. Not because they are incapable, but because the brain has learned, through direct experience, that effort does not matter. And here is the devastating part. Once learned helplessness is established, it generalizes. It bleeds from one area of life into others. A person who felt helpless in school carries that sense of futility into their professional life. A person whose efforts consistently went unrewarded in early relationships learns to stop investing before things get deep enough to hurt. Effort begins to feel pointless, not because it is, but because the nervous system was trained to believe that it is. Does any of this land for you? Have you ever noticed that your urge to quit does not appear randomly, that it tends to arrive at approximately the same moment, in the same phase, in almost every new project you begin? That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns have origins. Here is something I want you to understand very clearly. There is a specific emotional moment that almost always precedes giving up. Researchers sometimes call it the valley of disappointment. You begin something with energy and real hope. You work, you show up, you put in the effort, and the results do not come as quickly as you expected. There is a gap, a visible and uncomfortable gap, between the effort you are investing and the outcome you can see. And in that gap something breaks. Not your ability, not the potential of what you are building, something internal, something that says this is not working, this is not going to work, I cannot see how this gets from here to where I need it to be. That valley is where most people quit, not because they cannot continue, but because they cannot tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing whether continuing is worth it. James Clear, in Atomic Habits, describes this as the plateau of latent potential. He writes about how results that seem absent are actually forming beneath the surface, the way ice forms in water that has been below freezing for days before it becomes visible. The work is not wasted, the compound effect is accumulating. But because you cannot see it yet, the brain declares it absent, and most people give up at exactly that point. Just before the breakthrough becomes visible. The most painful part is that most of them never know how close they were. Now I want to talk about the dimension of this that almost never gets discussed, and it is the most important one: identity. People do not ultimately give up on tasks. They give up when a task begins to conflict with how they see themselves. If you have spent years carrying the quiet internal belief that you are someone who never finishes things, someone things never quite work out for, someone who starts strong but always fades somewhere in the middle, then pushing through is not just difficult, it is threatening. Because succeeding would require you to update your entire self-concept. And your brain, which values identity stability as a survival mechanism, actively resists that update. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. When our actions begin to conflict with our self-image, the brain does not automatically update the self-image. It often eliminates the conflicting behavior instead. It is neurologically easier to quit and remain consistent with the story of who you are than to push through and have to become someone new. This is why the people who persist are not simply more disciplined. They are often people who have built an identity in which persistence is simply part of what they do, not because of superior willpower, but because they have accumulated enough evidence, through enough repeated choices, that they have become someone who does not walk away when things get difficult, and that identity was built the same way yours was. Through small decisions, through the act of staying when quitting would have been easier, through the compound weight of choosing to continue, which means it can be built by you, right now. Beginning with the next decision you face. So what does that actually look like in practice? Because I know some of you listening are recognizing this pattern in yourself, and the question is not whether it is real. The question is what you do with it. The first thing is to change what difficulty means. Right now, when something gets hard, your brain reads that as a signal to stop. You need to actively retrain that interpretation. Difficulty does not mean stop. Difficulty means you have entered the phase of the process where almost everyone else quits. Which means if you do not quit here, you are already ahead of most people who ever attempted this. The second thing is to radically shrink your commitment. One of the primary reasons people give up is that the goal they set is too large, too distant, too abstract. The gap between where they are and where they want to be creates a kind of exhaustion before they even begin. So stop committing to the goal. Commit only to the next action, not the vision, not the outcome. The next step, just the next one. The third thing is to separate your identity from the outcome of any single effort. You are not the result. You are the person who shows up. The person who continues after stopping and tries again is fundamentally different from the person who stays down, not in talent, not in raw potential, but in who they are in the process of becoming. And finally, track your continuations, not just your results. Every single time you feel the pull to stop and choose to stay anyway, acknowledge it, write it down, mark it somewhere. Because what you are doing in that moment is creating evidence, new data for your brain to work with, the quiet, methodical rewriting of the story of who you are. I want to close with this because I believe it is the most important thing I will say in this entire video. Giving up too soon is almost never about the task. It is about the story that effort does not change outcomes, the story that you are not the kind of person this works for, the story that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is too wide and too permanent to cross. That story is not true, but it feels true, and that feeling, left unexamined, is enough to stop you every single time. The good news is that stories can be rewritten, not through a single dramatic decision or a sudden surge of motivation, but through the quiet, accumulating weight of small choices, each one adding a piece of evidence that says, I am someone who stays. I am someone who finds out what is on the other side of this. I am someone who does not leave at the valley. Because the valley is where almost everyone stops. And that means just past the valley it is almost empty. I would love to know. Is this something you recognize in yourself? Is there a specific area of your life where this pattern keeps showing up? And if you are honest with yourself, what do you think it is protecting you from? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And you may be surprised how many people are standing in exactly the same place you are right now. Thank you so much for watching. If this resonated with you, click subscribe, and do not miss the next video. I promise it is going to go even deeper. See you there.